Hey guys, this is Kirk from Go Make Music, and today is the final video for our Foundations of EQ course. If you haven't watched the first two videos on the frequency spectrum and the different types and parameters of EQ tools, go check those out, do the homework, and then come watch this video. Today, we are going to talk about 4 major philosophies or approaches to thinking about EQ moves in your mix. Now, I can't go through every single example of how to EQ every single instrument because there is a never-ending infinite amount of applications to these ideas, but I will give a few examples. Mostly, I want you to understand these concepts so that you can apply them to your own music, in your own taste, in your own situations. Let's get started. The number one thing I would say before making any major EQ decisions is to get a good balance first. What do I mean? Adjust your levels, your faders, your volume, to where you like where the mix is sitting and you have plenty of headroom in your output. I've done this beforehand, hardly any EQ going on. Okay, so it's really about the levels first, getting your balance right, and I have plenty of headroom. Let's see what I got. I'm gonna turn off this slight mastering chain. Just resetting by clicking. So when the snare hits, I'm at about -4.5. So I have a good amount of headroom. I probably would want to give myself a little bit more, but for this purpose, we're okay. Do a little bit of mixed bus compression and a slight limiting, just tickling the transients. And we're back. So what people do normally, which is not a great idea, is you pull up your faders, you haven't really started to do a balance, and what you do, they just solo the kick drum and they grab an EQ and they start boosting lows and cutting out mids and putting up highs, and they get this amazing sounding kick drum, and then they go great. And they move on to the next one and they EQ that up to make it awesome, and they solo the next one and EQ. And so they're just doing things because that's what you're supposed to do, quotation marks. And they're listening in solo mode. So you want to make your EQ decisions in the context of a balanced mix. If you do that, you're going to do way less dramatic EQ moves and things are going to sound better. So get a good balance first. Try not to listen too much in solo mode and you'll be off to a good start. I am okay with solo mode for doing some of your cleanup work and fine-tune adjustments, but try to make moves in the context of a mix, because nobody listens to your music in solo mode. All right, number 2, mix with your ears. I know that sounds simple, but sometimes when we're staring at a big computer screen or we're looking at analyzers on our EQ, right? We're looking at analyzers and studying waveforms, we're not using our ears. So mix with your ears as much as possible. And you were even going to mix with your body, your actual physical body. So sometimes the easiest way to do that is to close your eyes. Again, this sounds simple, but I'm telling you, it is going to really improve the way that you approach EQ and mixing in general if you close your eyes and listen. Even if you have to turn the lights off in the room, just do whatever you can to focus in with your ears. Listening is a skill that you develop, okay? So again, don't just go in here and say, oh, this is a guitar, I need to add some presence. Or this is a vocal, I need to scoop out some mud. Like, that's just mixing with your brain. That's mixing with something that you heard on a forum or something you read in an article or even something I told you in a video. It's not about that. It's about using your ears and then making decisions, okay? Now, if you're mixing with your body, what you're doing is that you're not even using your ears. You're actually listening and feeling to the low end resonate in your chest, resonate in your stomach. You have these body cavities that actually resonate with the low end, and depending on the tuning of your low end and if there's stuff competing, it's going to feel open or it's going to feel resonant, and you get to design that with EQ and with your sound design. But you have to learn how to use your body to feel that stuff. So I'm going to play this kick drum, and I want you, if you have speakers, turn them up a little bit. If you have headphones, you can feel low end in headphones. It's a little bit harder. But let's listen to this kick. So hopefully you're hearing a little bit of resonance in your lower chest, upper stomach area. Pay attention to that. That's part of what you're doing when you're making these decisions with EQ, is how does it affect not only your ears, but your body. So again, turn off your eyes, open your ears, and listen with your body. Also, you can get up and walk around the room and listen to the low end, listen to the frequencies. One trick that I've heard is guys going out into another room with the door open and listening, paying attention to what's cutting through the mix, through the door. It's not always about being in the sweet spot, although that is important, but use your ears in creative ways. Get up, move around the room, and pay attention with your body. And then always A/B your moves to see if you've actually made it better. All right, so let's take this kick, for example. We're going to listen in the context of a mix. I like where the high end is at right now. I feel like it's pumping through a little bit. But I want a little bit more on the sub and low end. So I'm going to do a low shelf. Nope. Low shelf. All right, so I did about a 3 dB boost from 116 and below. Now, here's the last thing on this mix with your ears. Always A/B your EQ moves to see if you've actually made it better. All right, I like it. It feels fuller, it's coming out, it's not too much. So you got a good balance first. You're mixing with your ears and not your eyes and not your brain. You're mixing with your body, closing your eyes if you have to. The next thing I want you to think about is a term called deductive EQ. So with deductive EQ, the first thing you think when you're listening is, what can I take away to make this sound better? So you're not automatically going to start boosting things. Here's a little story or a metaphor that will help you think about this. It's a little strange, but trust me, you'll remember it. Imagine you went to the gym and you have somewhere to go that evening and you're all sweaty, you're a little bit smelly, and you say, you know what, I'm just going to throw on some deodorant and a little bit of cologne, and that should be fine. That's not going to be fine. You're going to be funky. You're just going to be trying to cover up the funk with some sweet-smelling perfume and deodorant. You can't do that. You can't put good things on top of funky things and think you're going to make it better. What do you have to do? You have to take a shower first. You have to remove the bad stuff first. And then if you need to, want to, you can put on all the pretty things on top. So that's what I want you to think about when you're thinking about deductive EQs. Like, where are the funky frequencies? Where are the harsh frequencies? Where are the things that are just getting on my nerves? And how can I remove those first? And then, you know what? actually, it sounds great now. Or you know what? I just need to do a little subtle thing here and a subtle thing there, and we're there. Instead of instantly grabbing the boost and you're like, it still doesn't sound good. Well, it still doesn't sound good because you haven't removed the funk. So you gotta do that first. For example, you could take away low end and some mid range, and all of a sudden you have this bright clarity that comes into your sound. That you didn't do that by adding a bunch of high end. You did that by taking away low end and mid information. Not only is it going to make the sound more pleasant to listen to, it's also going to give you more headroom for your mix, which we already know is a wonderful thing. Another approach is that you could take away frequencies in like the mid and upper mids of an instrument that is competing with another instrument in its same range. I'll show you that in a second. For example, you could try carving out a few dBs in like the 1 to 2K range of a synth so that maybe vocals would have more room to be heard. All right, so let me show you what I mean by deductive EQ in this example. We're going to focus in on this pad and this ARP. But let's listen to the mix. Okay, so right now, I feel like this ARP has a lot of information in the upper mids. And I feel like if I was going to add vocals to this track, there would be some competition going on. So I'm going to do some deductive EQ to get rid of it. I'm also going to clean up a little bit of the low end so that it doesn't fight with the bass. Let's listen. All right, so I feel like I've cleaned up the sounds that were bugging me, and I've almost lost some of the presence of the sound. So what I'm actually going to do is turn it up a little bit. So a lot of times what you can think of is this is a volume fader. It's just a volume fader that's in a specific frequency range. So let's listen. All right, so I feel like that's really improved, especially if I was going to add some vocals into this situation. So when you're doing deductive EQ, one method of finding those problem frequencies is something I like to call seek and destroy. This is where you start with a boost, a subtle boost, and you scan the frequencies until that bad guy jumps out. And then you can get rid of them. It's good to have an idea of what you're looking for before you just start doing this, because when you do boosts, you're going to have a lot of bad things jump out, but they weren't necessarily the culprit. But this is how you would do it. Do your boost, and you just scan. Then you A/B. Awesome. So you do your boost, you do your scan. When you find it, you cut it, then you A/B, and you move on. There's seek and destroy. Okay, now let's look at this pad. I'm going to solo the pad so you can hear what we're doing a little bit better. So I'm hearing a lot of like low, mid rumble that I just don't need. And so I'm gonna roll a lot of that off. Then I'm gonna take out some of that mid. And what this does, it gives me a little bit of clarity, a little bit of headroom. Let's listen. You hear all that stuff? All right, so now let's listen to these two EQ moves in this context of the mix and see how it sounds. All right, I'm liking where it's going. So I carved out parts of the sound in the frequency spectrum that were kind of just getting on my nerves. And if it makes me have to balance some of the volume on the actual fader, then that's fine. But just think of deductive EQ, think of these as little volume faders on parts of your frequency spectrum. All right, the fourth thing is very similar to what we've already talked about, but what I want you to do is try to give each instrument its own lane to live in. And when I say lane, I mean like lanes of traffic. So like a 3-lane highway where you have cars in the fast lane and the middle lane and the right lane, and every single instrument has its own lane. Now there are going to be overlaps, like a bass might have some high end to it, or a synth might have some low end to it. But by and large, these instruments are going to have their lane that they live in. Now, this is better done with an arrangement and with your sound design, but this can be accentuated with EQ. So for example, I have these 3 musical elements. I have a bass, I have an ARP, and I have a pad. Now, the bass is obviously occupying the low end of my lanes. There's some top end, but the bulk of it is in the low end. Okay? My ARP has some low end, although I've cut it out. It's mostly mid-range. And then my pad is a high end. Now, some of the notes are going to go in the same range as my ARP, but for the most part, this is my high end. So that's using your arrangement to kind of make your EQ decisions for you. And then you can kind of carve things out, and I could add a little bit of sparkle to my high end thing to kind of make it accentuated as the high element. But sometimes you might have something that is actually occupying similar spaces, and you need to use EQ to kind of carve things out. For example, kick and a bass. This is huge. So let's listen to this kick. And we're actually going to use the analyzer for educational purposes. Pay attention. There's a lot of low-end information here. There's not as much mid-range, low mids from 200 to 500 to 1K. And then there's tons of top end for a kick, a lot of snap. So it's kind of like low, nothing here, and then top end here. Let's look at the bass. The bass also has some low end, although it's not as punchy as the kick. But there's a lot of information in this 200 to 500 range. There's some top end, but not as much as the kick. So the bass has some low end and some top end, but a lot of this lower mids and mid range. Whereas the kick had a lot of sub and a lot of top, not a lot of mid. So it's almost like this low end sandwich that the bass is sitting in with a kick on either side of it. So in this particular case, the kick is below the bass and it's also above the bass. Those are the three lanes of this kind of low end. Now, that's not always going to be like that. Sometimes the bass is going to be below the kick, where the kick is not as much sub information. And you just have to make those choices based on the style and taste. Now, I can use this understanding in my EQ moves also, which is why I rolled off a subtle bit of the sub in the bass, and I accentuated some of the sub in the kick, just to kind of accent what was naturally happening with these sounds. So to recap, get a good balance, mix with your ears, not with your eyes, use deductive EQ, think about what you can take away, try to give each instrument its own lane to live in, whether that's with arrangement or with using EQ. And then I want to give you these two guidelines real quick before we wrap up. When you're doing a boost, think about using a wide Q. For example, on this ARP. If I'm going to do a boost, see, if I do a narrow Q like that, it starts to get a little resonant frequency. But if I widen, when you use a wide Q on a boost, it creates this kind of subtle feathering effect where you don't get resonant frequencies, you just get tone, okay? So when you're doing boost, generally you want to use a wide Q. Now when you do cuts, this is more of a narrow Q. Now I could do a notch filter if I wanted to just get that resonant frequency. And just get that. So you could do that with a super narrow band, or you could kind of notch out a wider range, and that could be good too. Okay, so boost with wide Qs, cut with narrow Qs. The last thing I want to show you is your compression before or after EQ. People ask me all the time, and the answer is yes. So what I typically would do is do a cut before your compression and do any boosts after compression. For example, if I were to do this boost of my low end into my compressor, I'm kind of messing myself up, because the more that I push up the volume into the compressor, the more the compressor is going to turn it down. So I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot. Let me show you. See, the higher I make this go up, the more this needle takes off. So you don't want to boost into your compressor, especially with low end, because you're going to make the compressor turn yourself down, and the very thing you want to turn up is going to make the whole thing get turned down. It's catch-22. Now, there are certain effects that can happen when you do that, so experiment with it, and if you like what it's doing, if it sounds good, it is good, but it's just a concept I want you to understand. So typically what I might do is I would do a cut. So maybe I would cut my sub lows and maybe do a shelf taken out some of the high end if I wanted to. I would do that first into my compressor. So this is where we're at. So this is the cuts. Then I would do my compression. And then I would do my boost after compression. So the compressor kind of stabilizes the sound. And then I can do my tone shaping. Okay, so boost with a wide Q, cut with a narrow Q. Try to make some of your cuts before your compression, and then do any of your boosts after compression. I hope this has been a helpful series for you. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Don't forget to grab the Foundations of EQ reference guide. It's free at the website or in the link in the description. All right, experiment with this stuff. If you have any questions, let me know. And until next time, go make music.